The first thing she tasted was blood and sand. Sarah Whitmore's tongue scraped against her teeth as her cracked lips tried to peel apart. Her throat felt scorched, as if she had swallowed a furnace whole. When she tried to scream, nothing came but a rasp, thin, pitiful, instantly swallowed by the immensity of the desert. The sky above was an endless, merciless blue, without a single cloud to soften the hammering sun. It burned her pale skin until it blistered, turning the crown of her forehead raw. Flies landed at the corners of her mouth, drawn by the salt of sweat and the faint metallic sting of dried blood. She could not swat them away. Her body was gone, or rather, stolen from her. Every inch of her from the collarbones down was buried under the packed earth, smothered by sand that pressed against her ribs so tightly she could only draw shallow breaths. The weight was maddening. She could wiggle her fingertips, but they scraped only more sand in the darkness below. She felt like she had been swallowed whole, left as nothing more than a head sticking grotesquely from the ground. A single thought pounded through her skull with each desperate heartbeat. This is how I died. The vultures had been first to notice. Their circling shapes moved slowly against the hard sky, black wings flickering like the hands of a cruel clock. They dipped lower with each pass. She could hear the occasional rush of feathers, close enough that her skin prickled. Coyotes, too, prowled somewhere beyond the ridge. She heard their high yips last night when the desert turned bitter cold and she prayed for death to come quickly. But dawn had betrayed her with its cruel return of light, and the men who had left her here had not come back. They never would. Sarah remembered everything, with brutal clarity: the ambush on the trail, the way they rode down from the cliffs like wolves. There were 3 of them, men she had seen before in the border town of Benson, gamblers and gunmen, their eyes always scanning, their hands always near the butts of their pistols. They had followed her stagecoach, waiting until dusk before springing. The driver was shot before he could lift his rifle. The others fled or were dragged off. And Sarah, 30 years old and still clutching her satchel of worthless papers and a locket with her mother's picture, was taken alive. She remembered their laughter, coarse and booming, when they decided her fate. They dragged her into a dry arroyo where the sand was loose and deep. She kicked, cursed, begged, but they only shoved her down and began to dig with their boots and hands. They forced her into the hole, packed the sand against her body until she couldn't move. When she screamed, they shoved a kerchief in her mouth. When she cried, they said she'd make fine food for the coyotes. Their laughter echoed in her ears even now, though they were long gone. Her tears had dried into salt on her cheeks. The sun climbed higher. The sand pressed tighter. Her breaths grew shorter, as though the desert itself wanted to suffocate her. Time became a blur. Minutes or hours, she could no longer tell. The heat pressed down like a smith's anvil, and her mind drifted to strange places: her father's farm in Kansas, the smell of rain on plowed earth, the sound of her younger brother playing fiddle on summer nights. She wanted to hear that sound one last time. She wanted to see her mother's face. Instead, the desert offered only silence. Then movement. From the corner of her blurred, sun-swollen vision, she saw a shadow detach itself from the horizon. A figure walking with steady, deliberate steps across the ridge. For a terrible moment, terror spiked in her chest. The men, they've come back. They'll finish me this time. She tried to scream, but her throat betrayed her. The figure grew closer. Broad shoulders, long black hair catching the wind. A shape carved against the brutal light, walking without hurry yet with uncheckable purpose. When he came within sight, Sarah's breath hitched. He was not one of the gunmen. It was an Apache warrior, bare-chested, his bronze skin glistening with sweat, streaked with ochre paint across his arms and chest. Tribal jewelry clinked softly at his neck and wrists, and a knife hung at his side. His eyes, dark and sharp as obsidian, scanned the horizon before locking onto her. For an instant, She thought he might leave her. Why wouldn't he? What was she to him? An enemy, a settler woman, just another sign of a world that had pushed his people off their own lands. But he did not turn away. Instead, he came to her. His shadow fell over her blistered face, a cool relief in the punishing sun. He dropped to his knees in front of her, and without a word, his hands plunged into the sand. He scooped and clawed like a man possessed, his fingers cutting through the earth with frantic urgency. Sarah gasped as the first cool breath of air reached her ribs. For the first time since the nightmare began, the suffocating weight lessened. Tears sprang to her eyes, carving muddy trails through the dirt on her face. She wanted to ask why. She wanted to beg him not to stop. She wanted to cling to this stranger like a drowning woman clings to driftwood. But her lips trembled and no words came. Only gratitude. Only disbelief. Only the first flicker of hope she had felt in days, because for the first time she believed she might live. The first breath Sarah drew when her chest was freed felt like swallowing life itself. The Apache's hands worked quickly, scooping, clawing, pulling the suffocating sand away. Each handful he threw aside released more of her body until, with a wrench of his strong arms, he seized her beneath the shoulders and pulled her up into the blistering sunlight. Sarah collapsed forward, coughing violently, her lungs struggling to adjust after hours of shallow gulps. Grit poured from her clothes, falling in small avalanches onto the ground. Every muscle screamed as she tried to move. For a moment she simply knelt in the sand, her palms pressed against it, her body trembling like a newborn foal. She looked up at him. The Apache knelt a few feet away, his chest rising and falling steadily, as if digging a half-buried stranger from death was nothing extraordinary. His hands were raw, small streaks of blood marking his knuckles where the coarse sand had torn the skin. He watched her without expression, his eyes sharp and unreadable. Sarah's first instinct was fear. Back in town, men spoke of Apaches as ghosts of the desert merciless, skilled in ways no white man could match, appearing and vanishing like shadows. She had heard tales whispered in saloons, scalps taken, wagons burned, soldiers ambushed and slaughtered. Yet here he was, and he had saved her life. The contradiction left her reeling. Why? Her voice cracked, barely more than a rasp. Her throat burned with dryness. Why? Help me? The Apache tilted his head slightly, as though weighing whether she was worth answering. At last he rose to his full height, towering above her. His long black hair rippled in the wind, strands clinging to his sweat-slicked shoulders. He looked down at her, then reached into a pouch tied at his waist. From it, he produced a small leather flask. Sarah's eyes widened. Water. She reached out instinctively, but hesitated. What if it was a trick? What if he meant to keep her alive only for some crueler fate? Yet her thirst screamed louder than her doubts. With shaking hands, she took the flask. The water inside was warm, tasting faintly of leather, but to her it was nectar. She drank greedily, spilling some down her chin, until he pulled it gently back, not allowing her to empty it all at once. Her breathing slowed. Her heartbeat eased. Life seeped back into her. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice steadier this time. The warrior crouched before her again, studying her face. He seemed younger up close than she first thought, perhaps not much older than 30, like herself. His features were strong, carved by the sun and wind of the land, yet his eyes held something deeper than stone, the weight of someone who had seen too much. Finally, he spoke. His voice was low, edged with an accent, his English clear but measured. "You are not meant to die here." Sarah blinked, confused. "Those men—" "They left me." His gaze hardened. "White men." He spat the word softly, not with hatred, but with the certainty of one naming a snake. She dropped her eyes, ashamed though she had done nothing to deserve this fate. Still, his words carried a truth she could not deny. The very people she shared blood and tongue with had buried her alive, and the one her kind called an enemy had saved her. She glanced at him again. "What should I call you?" For a moment, silence stretched between them. The desert wind sighed through the sagebrush, carrying the faint cry of a hawk overhead. At last he answered, "Takoda." The name rolled off his tongue with quiet strength. "Takoda," she repeated softly, the sound foreign yet grounding. She touched her throat, where bruises still lingered from the men's rough hands. "My name is Sarah Whitmore." His eyes flickered, but he gave no sign of recognition. Takoda rose again, scanning the horizon, every movement precise, as if danger could emerge at any moment. His posture was that of a man who trusted nothing, not the sky, not the silence, not even her. He motioned with his chin toward the distant line of cliffs. "Come. If you stay, you die." Sarah tried to stand. Pain shot through her legs as the blood returned, tingling like hot needles. She staggered, nearly falling back into the sand, but Takoda caught her by the arm, his grip firm yet careful. Their eyes met again. She saw no softness there, but neither did she see cruelty. "Why are you helping me?" she asked once more, breathless. Takoda's jaw tightened. "Because they should not decide who lives and who dies." It was all the answer he gave. Sarah stumbled beside him, her legs weak, her mind spinning. Every step felt like defiance against the grave she had already half accepted. She glanced once over her shoulder, back at the shallow pit where her head had protruded from the earth. A shiver raced through her. The desert had nearly claimed her, but now, beside this silent, muscular Apache with long black hair and tribal jewelry glinting in the sun, she walked back into life. The desert stretched endlessly, a shifting sea of gold and brown under the merciless sun. Sarah Whitmore leaned heavily on Takoda's arm, her legs still trembling from hours buried in the sand. Every step was agony, her muscles stiff and her lungs ragged. The warrior's steady stride beside her was almost unnerving. He moved with the effortless certainty of a man born of the land, each footfall precise, deliberate, almost silent against the desert floor. "Where?" "Are we going?" Sarah asked, her voice hoarse. Takoda didn't answer immediately. His dark eyes scanned the horizon, narrowing at every ridge and dune as though the desert itself might conceal enemies. The wind whipped strands of his long black hair across his face, the tribal jewelry around his neck and wrists catching the sunlight. He finally said, low and deliberate, "Water, shelter, then safety." Sarah nodded weakly. She could hardly imagine safety after what had happened. Her mind replayed the ambush repeatedly, the faces of the men who had left her for dead engraved behind her eyelids. Every sound, the distant cry of a hawk, the whisper of the wind through the sagebrush felt like a threat. Yet she couldn't deny the strange calm that clung to Takoda, as though his presence alone offered a tether to survival. The sand beneath them was scorching, forcing them to take careful, uneven steps. Takoda stooped now and then to scoop some into his hands, letting it trickle back into the desert, a habit Sarah didn't understand. Once, he paused, crouched low, and extended a hand toward a small lizard skittering across the dune. It froze at his shadow and then scurried away. A lesson, she realized, in patience and observation. Hours passed, the sun dipping lower, painting the world in harsh reds and golds. Sarah's throat was raw, her stomach gnawed by hunger, and her legs shook with fatigue. At one point, she stumbled and almost fell backward into a shallow gully. Takoda's hand shot out, gripping her forearm and holding her upright. His fingers were strong, calloused, yet gentle. "Thank you," she whispered, trembling. His eyes softened just slightly. "Do not thank me yet. The desert is not finished." She shivered at his words. The air had cooled slightly, but the threat lingered in every shadow. She noticed the small, almost imperceptible tracks in the sand, coyote paw prints, the faint impressions of horses from long ago. Takoda walked ahead, scanning, then back at her, ensuring she followed. She realized that each moment of respite was temporary. The desert demanded respect, and death lurked in every step. At midday, they came upon a narrow wash, carved deep into the earth by years of fleeting rains. Takoda motioned for her to crouch. He inspected the walls, tracing patterns with his hands, then pointed to a shaded nook near a boulder. Sarah sank to the sand, leaning against the rock as he disappeared briefly behind a ridge. When he returned, he carried a small gourd filled with water, which he held out to her. She drank carefully this time, savoring each sip, letting it revive her sun-scorched throat. She glanced at him, wondering who he was beyond the desert warrior she saw before her. Why? Why save me? She asked again, her voice quieter than before. Takoda's jaw tightened, and he looked away toward the horizon. Because injustice is not meant to stand, he said. Because the desert decides who survives, and sometimes I intervene. She swallowed, unsure what to say. She had been raised in towns where people spoke boldly but acted in cowardice. Here, in this harsh land, survival was truth, and Takoda seemed to embody it fully. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, Takoda led her to a small cluster of mesquite trees, where shade and a trickle of cool water promised a brief reprieve. Sarah sank to the ground, letting exhaustion pull her into a fragile, shivering rest. The wind stirred the sand around her, carrying the scent of earth and sage, and she realized she had not felt safe for days. Not until Takoda appeared, not until his hands pulled her from death itself. When she dared to open her eyes again, he was watching her, silent and still, like a guardian carved from the desert itself. There was no warmth in his smile. He did not smile, but there was purpose, and there was protection. For the first time since the ambush, Sarah Whitmore allowed herself to believe in survival. But deep down, she knew their journey had only begun. The desert was vast. The men who had buried her would not be satisfied, and she, small and unarmed, would have to rely entirely on the warrior who had saved her life. By late afternoon, the sun had begun its slow descent, painting the desert in molten gold and deep shadows. Sarah Whitmore's legs ached with every step, each movement a reminder of hours spent buried beneath the sand. Her skin burned where the sun had bitten it, and a persistent cough rattled in her chest. Takoda moved beside her with the certainty of a man who had spent a lifetime reading the desert, every ridge, dune, and shadow registering like a map in his mind. "Are we far?" Sarah asked, her voice raw. Takoda didn't answer immediately. He scanned the horizon, nostrils flaring, eyes narrowed against the glaring sun. Finally he said, "Enough to rest, but not enough to be safe." Sarah shivered. The idea of being safe seemed absurd. She had been buried alive by men she once trusted, left for vultures and coyotes, and now walked beside a stranger whose presence was both comforting and unnerving. Hours earlier, when he had pulled her from the sand, Sarah had felt fragile, almost broken. Now, with the desert stretching endlessly in every direction, she felt something different, a cautious hope tinged with fear. Takoda moved with the confidence of a predator and the patience of a teacher, allowing her to match his pace while observing the environment with precision. As the afternoon heat began to fade, the desert seemed to shift. Shadows lengthened unnaturally, and a distant rumble reached her ears, hooves striking sand. Her heart jolted, fear flashing across her face. Takoda's hand shot out, gripping her shoulder and spinning her behind a small cluster of rocks. "Stay down," he whispered. His voice was calm, yet sharp, a command that brooked no argument. Through the thin gaps between the rocks, Sarah saw them, two riders approaching from the west. The men were mounted on horses, their guns glinting in the late sun, faces obscured by wide-brimmed hats. Her stomach tightened, memories of the ambush flooding back. "They're the ones," she breathed, clutching Takoda's arm. "They may not be the same," he said, voice low, "but they hunt like wolves. Move carefully." He led her across the shallow wash, his movements precise, silent. Every instinct honed from years of survival guided him. Sarah followed, trusting him entirely, though fear gnawed at her every step. She noticed the way he constantly checked behind them, scanning for signs, reading the subtle shifts in the sand and wind. It was like watching a hawk navigate the currents of the air. When they reached a small outcropping of boulders, Takoda crouched low, motioning for her to do the same. "They will pass." "Wait," he said. His eyes never left the approaching riders. Sarah's pulse raced and her breath came shallow. The horses drew closer, hooves pounding rhythmically, dust swirling in a thick, choking cloud. Takoda's hand brushed hers, a silent reassurance, and she realized she wasn't just following him out of necessity, she trusted him. The riders thundered past, unaware of the two figures crouched low in the shadows. Once the dust cleared, Takoda exhaled, though only slightly. He turned to Sarah. "You must be stronger than you believe. The desert respects those who endure, not those who beg." Sarah nodded, her throat tight. She wanted to ask him more, but the moment had passed, replaced by the quiet intensity of the desert settling around them. The sun dipped lower, bathing everything in crimson light, and a cool breeze stirred the sand. Takoda led her onward, toward a narrow canyon where shade promised temporary relief. As they walked, he spoke little, but when he did, his words carried weight. The desert teaches patience, observation, and caution. All who ignore it perish. Sarah swallowed hard, feeling both the wisdom and the threat behind his words. She realized she had relied on luck to survive until now. With Takoda, survival felt possible, but it demanded vigilance, trust, and learning to see the world through his eyes. By nightfall, they reached a small alcove beneath a jagged rock formation. Takoda gestured for her to rest. He gathered brush to make a small fire, not large enough to draw attention, but enough to keep them warm. The flickering light highlighted his chiseled features, long black hair, and tribal jewelry glinting in the firelight. As Sarah settled on the cool sand, exhausted beyond measure. She felt an unfamiliar sensation, gratitude, respect, and a tentative bond forming with the man who had saved her life. But even as her body found momentary relief, a whisper of worry lingered in her mind. The desert was vast, the men were still out there, and Takoda had only just revealed a fraction of his skill. Survival was no longer about digging out of sand, it was about learning to move, to read, and to trust in a world that had tried to kill her at every turn. And in the glow of the fire, with shadows dancing across the rocks, Sarah Whitmore understood that her journey had only just begun. Night had fallen, and the desert was a tapestry of shadows and silver moonlight. Sarah Whitmore shivered as she huddled beneath the small alcove Takoda had chosen. The fire they built reduced to glowing embers. Her arms wrapped around her knees, still aching from being buried alive, her body sore from hours of walking. The air was cool, a stark contrast to the day's oppressive heat, and the scent of sage and dry earth filled her lungs. Takoda sat a few feet away, his chest bare, muscles taut under the flickering light, long black hair falling across his shoulders. His dark eyes scanned the horizon, and though he said nothing, Sarah could feel the alertness radiating from him. Every flicker of wind, every distant sound of desert wildlife, seemed to register in his mind with exact precision. She watched him quietly, marveling at his focus. He had saved her life, guided her across a landscape that would have claimed her otherwise, and now, even as she rested, he remained vigilant. She felt a mixture of gratitude and awe, but also the fragile awareness that survival in this world demanded more than passive hope. Minutes passed like hours. Then, a soft rustle in the distance made Takoda shift instantly, his body coiling like a panther. Sarah froze, following his gaze toward a dark ridge where shadows moved unnaturally. Two figures on horseback approached slowly, their shapes blurred by the moonlight but unmistakable in their purpose. "Outlaws?" Takoda muttered, his voice barely audible. He gestured for Sarah to remain still. "Stay low. Do not make a sound." Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. She wanted to run, but instinct told her to obey. Takoda's hand brushed hers briefly, a silent reassurance that she was not alone. Together, they waited as the outlaws drew closer, horses' hooves crunching softly on the sandy ground. When the riders were within sight, Takoda rose slowly, each movement calculated. He picked up a handful of sand and let it trickle to the ground near their hiding spot, drawing the attention of the nearest rider. The man turned instinctively, giving Takoda the briefest advantage. With the speed of a striking snake, Takoda leapt from cover, grabbing the horse's reins and yanking it sideways. The rider was thrown off balance, and his companion reacted too slowly. Sarah's eyes widened as Takoda moved with lethal precision, his bare hands and agility overpowering the two attackers in mere moments. She wanted to scream, to run to him, but he had already dispatched them, dragging one rider unconscious behind a boulder while the other fled into the desert. The silence that followed was thick and tense, her breath caught in her throat. You're incredible," she whispered. Takoda's expression remained serious, but there was a flicker of something she hadn't seen before, approval, perhaps, or relief. "This is survival." "Nothing more," he said. Sarah swallowed hard, realizing how fragile her existence had been, how close death had lurked at every step. And yet, here she was, alive, guided by a man whose knowledge of the land and instinct for danger was absolute. The wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of smoke from the outlaws' camp, long enough to remind them that this victory was temporary. Takoda packed up the fire quickly, leaving only faint embers to mark their resting place. "We move," he said, his voice firm. "The desert is not safe for the careless." Sarah rose shakily, leaning on him for support. She noticed for the first time the countless small scars on his arms and chest, marks of survival in a world that offered no mercy. Her own body ached, but her resolve strengthened. Survival was no longer just about enduring, it was about learning, observing, and trusting in the wisdom of someone who had lived by instincts she was only beginning to understand. As they continued across the desert under a blanket of stars, Sarah glanced at Takoda. He walked with a calm confidence, yet she could feel the tension coiled in his muscles, the constant awareness that danger could strike at any moment. She realized something profound. Her life had been given back to her, but it came with responsibility. She would have to move, think, and endure alongside Takoda if she hoped to survive this desert and the men who sought her. And for the first time since she had been buried alive, she felt a tentative strength rising within her, not just gratitude, but determination. Survival was not a gift. It was a battle. And with Takoda by her side, perhaps she could learn to fight it. Dawn broke over the desert with a pale, almost merciless light. Sarah Whitmore's eyelids were heavy, her body screaming from exhaustion, but she forced herself to move. Takoda was already ahead, every step deliberate, his dark eyes scanning the horizon with the precision of a man who lived by instinct. The desert stretched before them, a harsh sea of sand and jagged rock, beautiful and lethal all at once. Sarah limped beside him, her skin still raw from the sun and her muscles sore from the long hours of walking. She could barely imagine the strength it had taken for him to save her, to fight off the outlaws the night before, to lead her across this unrelenting wasteland. And yet, there he was, unwavering, his bare chest glistening in the early light, long black hair whipping in the wind, ochre streaks marking his skin like symbols of survival, tribal jewelry glinting softly. "Are we far?" she asked, her voice raspy, almost breaking. Takoda did not answer immediately. He stopped for a moment, crouched low, and scanned the desert floor. Tiny tracks marred the sand coyote prints, horse tracks from far-off riders. He lifted a hand, signaling her to pause. "Danger ahead," he murmured, his voice low, controlled, yet urgent. Sarah's heart thumped painfully in her chest. The desert had already tried to kill her once, and she knew without a doubt it would try again. Her legs shook, but she stayed close to him, trusting his instincts. She didn't have a choice. Takoda was not just her guide. He was her lifeline. As they crested a ridge, the cause of his caution became clear. A small band of men had set up camp in a shallow canyon below. Smoke from their fire curled into the air, mingling with the heat of the morning. They were rough-looking, armed, and oblivious to the two figures watching from above. "Stay behind me," Takoda whispered. "Do not make a sound." Sarah nodded, pressing herself against the cool rock, feeling her pulse quicken. Takoda moved with silent precision, descending the ridge with the grace of a predator. His eyes were sharp, every motion calculated. She followed, each step a careful mimicry of his, her trust in him absolute despite the fear gnawing at her. He reached the edge of the canyon and assessed the men. They were laughing, careless, their horses tethered too close, their guns leaning against rocks. Takoda's lips pressed into a thin line. With a sudden motion, he vanished into the shadows, moving like smoke across the sand. Sarah followed closely, her movements uncertain but determined. When they were behind the camp, Takoda acted. With a swift motion, he knocked a small branch against a rock, sending a soft clatter into the wind. One man turned, reaching for his gun, but Takoda was faster. He sprang from the shadows, grabbing the man's arm and twisting it with a force that made him yelp, dropping him to the ground. The others spun, but Takoda's precision was deadly. He disarmed, subdued, and positioned them with expert control. Sarah gasped, both horrified and awed. You're unstoppable," she whispered, clutching his arm for support. Takoda's eyes softened slightly at her words, but he said nothing. His focus never wavered, not until the camp was silent, the men incapacitated, and the immediate danger gone. He glanced at Sarah, measuring her exhaustion, then gestured toward a hidden path through the canyon. "Move quickly," he said. "We do not linger." She stumbled forward, leaning on him, feeling the adrenaline drain from her body as the desert's heat began to climb. Yet beneath the fear, there was a strange warmth, a growing sense of safety that only he could provide. In the vast, empty wilderness, Takoda was more than a protector, he was a lifeline, a bridge between death and survival. By midday, they reached a narrow alcove shaded by towering cliffs. Takoda crouched beside her, offering water from his gourd. She drank, savoring each cool sip, and finally dared to look at him fully. His face was impassive, yet she could see the depth of his vigilance, the burden of experience etched into every line. "Why?" "Help me?" she asked quietly, though she had asked before. Takoda's gaze lingered on the horizon before returning to her. "Because you were left for death, and I do not stand idly by injustice," he said simply. Sarah nodded, understanding in a way she hadn't before. In a world that had tried to crush her, he had given her life again. And now, side by side, they would face whatever the desert had left to throw at them. The wind stirred, whispering through the canyon, and Sarah Whitmore realized something. Survival was no longer a question of luck. With Takoda, it was a battle, and she was ready to fight. The sun had begun to sink behind jagged cliffs, painting the desert in deep shades of red and orange as if the earth itself were bleeding. Sarah Whitmore's body ached from exhaustion, but she forced herself to move, leaning heavily on Takoda. Every step across the uneven terrain was a testament to her will to survive. The desert was relentless, yet the bond she had formed with Takoda gave her strength she didn't know she possessed. "Are we almost safe?" she asked, her voice raspy. Takoda's dark eyes scanned the horizon, alert and unyielding. "Safe is a word the desert does not know," he said. "But there is shelter ahead." She followed, trusting him implicitly. For days he had guided her through treacherous terrain, evaded dangerous men, and kept her alive. She had seen his strength, his precision, and his uncanny ability to read the desert as if it were an extension of himself. And yet she still wondered about the man beneath the warrior's exterior, the one who had risked everything to pull her from a shallow grave and carry her through a world that wanted her dead. As they approached a narrow pass between towering rocks, a sudden rustle caught Sarah's attention. She froze, heart hammering in her chest. Takoda raised a hand, signaling her to remain still. From the shadows, a small group of men emerged, outlaws, likely the ones who had ambushed her before. Their horses shifted nervously, but they were clearly determined to make Sarah pay for surviving. Takoda moved first, his bare feet silent against the sand, muscles coiling like springs. He gestured for Sarah to stay low, then launched into action with the precision of a seasoned warrior. Within moments, he had disarmed two of the men, using their own momentum against them, while the others hesitated, unsure how to confront someone so skilled. Sarah's chest tightened with fear and awe. She had watched him fight before, but the intensity now, the immediacy of life and death, was staggering. And yet, she felt an odd calm settle over her. Takoda was there. He had always been there. One of the men lunged toward her, gun raised, but Takoda was faster. With a swift, fluid motion, he intercepted the attacker, twisting his arm and sending him sprawling to the ground. The remaining outlaws, realizing they were outmatched, bolted into the desert, leaving their fallen companions behind. Takoda stood tall, chest heaving slightly from exertion, eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of pursuit. He wiped the sweat and dust from his brow with the back of his hand, then extended a steadying hand toward Sarah. She took it, gripping it tightly, feeling a surge of relief and gratitude. For the first time in days, she allowed herself to breathe fully, to feel the safety of survival, though she knew it was temporary, fragile and hard-won. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Takoda's eyes softened, and he inclined his head slightly. "You have survived," he said simply. "That is enough for now." Sarah looked at him, studying the lines of his face, the strength of his body, and the quiet authority he exuded. He had saved her life, yes, but more than that, he had taught her something vital: resilience, patience, and trust. The desert had tried to take her, yet here she was, alive because of him. They continued walking until the pass opened into a sheltered valley. A small creek wound through the rocks, and mesquite trees provided shade and a place to rest. Sarah sank to the ground, relief washing over her in waves. Takoda knelt beside her, keeping watch, but she felt safe enough to close her eyes for a moment. When she opened them again, the sky had deepened into a twilight violet, stars beginning to pierce the darkening expanse. She realized that survival was not about defeating every threat, but about enduring, about walking through danger and trusting those who could guide you. Takoda looked down at her, long black hair falling over his shoulders, tribal jewelry catching the fading light. "You are strong," he said, almost as if confirming a truth he had observed all along. Sarah nodded, feeling it in her bones. She had been buried alive, abandoned, hunted, and yet she had survived. With Takoda, She had learned to move through the desert not as prey, but as someone who could endure, someone who could live. The two of them remained there for a while, side by side, listening to the gentle burble of the creek and the whisper of the wind through the mesquite. The desert was still harsh, still dangerous, but for the first time, it felt like a place where they could exist together, alive, alert, and determined. Sarah Whitmore finally allowed herself a faint smile, knowing that though the desert would always test her, she had a companion in Takoda, a warrior who had dug her out of death and shown her the path back to life. Night wrapped around them like a protective shroud, and for the first time since her nightmare began, Sarah understood that she had survived not by chance, but by courage, instinct, and the unwavering hands of the man who had saved her.